Today we're going to be learning about China during the Cold War, including the very famous Chinese Communist Revolution. Now, China's been a reoccurring major topic in world history because, as a country, it's kind of a big deal. So, these first couple of slides are going to be spent reviewing some of the stuff we've already learned about China just to help you set the scene and get your bearings. We'll be starting in the 1860s when China undertakes what it calls a self strengthening movement. China, for a long time in world history, had been a very powerful region, but by the 1860s, its power was clearly in decline. A lot of China had been carved up into spheres of influence, so sort of unofficial colonies where various outside countries, mostly Western powers, are sort of pulling the government strings and effectively running the place. China had also just had its butt kicked by Japan in the Sino-Japanese War, and the massive Chinese empire being beaten by a relatively small island nation was a big shock to their pride. China had also just weathered the Taiping Rebellion, a peasant uprising that attempted to overthrow the Qing dynasty, and was one of the most violent and deadly upheavals in the entire century. So, in short, things are not going well for China. During the self strengthening movement, there is an attempt to regain some of China's historical power by trying to westernize and industrialize. At this point, there's widespread recognition that the countries that are emerging as world powers, the Western countries, are getting their power from their industrialization. However, this attempt at reform is upset by the rise to power of Empress Dowager Cixi, a member of the Qing dynasty. Because a lot of this westernization and industrialization promotes moving away from monarchies and into a more democratic system, as the Dowager Empress, this would mean a loss of power for her, and she opposed it. She seizes power. Most of her rivals end up dying mysterious deaths. Empress Dowager Cixi has a ruthless reputation. Once in power, she undoes a lot of reforms, and she encourages another uprising we learned about, the Boxer Rebellion, to try and drive Western powers out of China. So Empress Dowager Cixi's rule represents a big step backwards in terms of China's attempts to industrialize and modernize. But this doesn't go well. The Western powers crush the Boxer Rebellion and use it as an excuse to seize even more power within China, sort of saying, look, you can't rule yourselves, we're going to have to step in and take charge, and the Qing dynasty is weakened further. Then Cixi dies, and the person left in charge is the 3-month-old Emperor Hui. Very adorable child, probably not someone you want running a massive empire in a time of crisis. So all of these different things, the defeat of the Boxer Rebellion, the death of Emperor Cixi, and a 3-month-old now running the show, combine to make China very weak. And so Chinese reformers decide that they've got to make a move. Most of these are going to be from a generation that was actually educated in the West, so going to either Europe or America for schooling, and they're going to try and implement Western-style democracy and industrialization to regain China's historical power. The leader of this 1911 revolution is Sun Yat-sen. He went to college in the United States, San Francisco specifically, and he successfully leads the revolution, and at the end is named the first president. And that's where we had sort of left off the story before. Yay, democracy, China's got a president now. But things were not quite that simple. During the revolution of 1911, Sun Yat-sen gained a lot of popularity as a political leader. However, the revolution also involved a lot of military action, and the revolution's army was led by this fellow, Yuan Shikai. And because he had been in charge of the revolution's military forces, he had been kind of de facto in charge of the entire revolution. Once the revolution was resolved, he didn't really want to give up that power. Sun Yat-sen, even though he had been officially elected president, realized that trying to hold on to that title might cause a conflict with Yuan Shikai and kick off a civil war. China had just been through a massive upheaval. He didn't want to subject it to another conflict, and so for the sake of the well-being of China, he decides to step down and let Yuan Shikai hold power, sacrificing his own personal power and achievement for what he saw as the greater good. Unfortunately, Yuan Shikai is not a very good guy, and stepping down to let him hold on to power ends up being a very bad call. Instead of helping strengthening China, Yuan Shikai focuses on just growing his own personal power. Sun Yat-sen realizes that leaving this guy in charge was a bad call, and he starts organizing a group in opposition to him, a group known as the Nationalism Party, also called the Kuomintang, or for short, the KMT. and I'll be referring to it as the KMT from here on out, both to make your notes short and to save you from my terrible Chinese pronunciation. The KMT is very popular. Sun Yat-sen himself is a very popular figure within China. You can think of him as kind of the Chinese George Washington. And so his party, the KMT, wins the 1913 elections. Yuan Shikai is not happy that he just lost the elections, and so, acting more and more like a totalitarian dictator, he bans the KMT and has its leaders killed. Sun Yat-sen does successfully escape, and he will return later in our story. Continuing his attempt to seize absolute power, Yuan dissolves China's democratic government, its parliament, and declares himself a emperor, so going right back to the dynasty system that the revolution of 1911 had tried to get rid of. The Chinese people say, wait a minute, that's not what we want, and rebellions break out across China. And then, anticlimactically, a few years later, Yuan Shikai just gets sick and dies. However, the fragmentation that had been created by his attempt to seize imperial power remains, and there's going to be ongoing conflict in China as Sun Yat-sen, returning from exile, attempts to bring together all the different areas that had broken off in rebellion. This is a pretty big undertaking. China's a pretty big country, and so Sun Yat-sen asks for help. First, he turns to the Western powers, European countries like Britain and France, and also America. However, the West refuses to help. And so he turns to the other emerging world power, the Soviet Union, the USSR. The Soviet Union agrees to help, but they're going to encourage the development of communism in China as part of this. And so the newly established Chinese Communist Party, known as the CCP, starts working alongside the KMT to try and bring China together. Sun Yat-sen sends his main general, Chiang Kai-shek, to the Soviet Union to learn military strategy. Chiang Kai-shek then returns to China with a formidable military force, and by 1926, Chiang is able to gain military control of most of China on behalf of the KMT and Sun Yat-sen. So things are starting to look optimistic again. But then Sun Yat-sen dies. And without this George Washington-like figure at the head, the KMT fragments into different groups, all competing for power. The two main groups are going to be the more radical socialist, led by the communist Mao Zedong, and then the more conservative party, mostly made up of wealthy people who don't want the social change that the socialists are pushing, and they're going to be led by Chiang Kai-shek. Because even though Chiang Kai-shek was trained in the Soviet Union, he himself is not particularly pro-communist. He's from a very wealthy family, and the type of social upheaval that socialism and communism encourages would be a big threat to his family's traditional wealth and power. Chiang Kai-shek, as a military leader, is acting from a position of power, and he's able to successfully kick the communists out from both the army and the KMT party. In the process, a lot of them are arrested and executed. This is a pretty violent seizing of power. However, even though it's not exactly in keeping with a lot of democratic ideals, Western democracies like Britain and America are very happy to see the communists driven from power in China, and they officially recognize Chiang Kai-shek's government as the official legal government of China. Here are two major Western leaders, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, meeting with Chiang Kai-shek. With the purging of the Communist Party from both the army and the KMT, Mao Zedong has to flee, but he isn't killed. Instead, he travels to some of the more mountainous regions in China, an area that it would be difficult for Chiang Kai-shek's military to track him down in, and he starts building his own army, known as the Red Army. This army is mostly going to be made up of peasants, and it's fairly easy for Mao Zedong to recruit these peasants because one of his main activities in promoting socialism and communism is to go to the estates of wealthy landowners in the area, use his steadily growing army to seize their land, and then give it to poor peasants in the region. And telling peasants, hey, join my army and I'll give you land, is a pretty good recruitment tool, and his army grows very quickly. It's not going to have the equipment or the numbers that Chiang Kai-shek's official Western-backed military is going to have, and so Mao Zedong is going to specialize in guerrilla tactics. He's not going to participate in pitched battles. Instead, he's going to use things like ambushes and strategic retreats. Eventually, Mao Zedong's Red Army is going to become powerful enough that the other communist leaders, because Mao Zedong doesn't have complete control of the Communist Party in China, The other communist leaders think that it is strong enough to stand up to a direct battle with Chiang Kai shek's army, and so they pressure Mao Zedong into a direct confrontation. This does not go well. Chiang Kai shek's nationalist army completely crushes Mao Zedong's Red Army, and Mao Zedong is forced to go on a brutal retreat known as the Long March. It is 6,000 miles long, and you can see it just winding across China. They are under attack by Chiang Kai shek's forces the entire way, and only 8,000 of 100,000 troops make it. That is an 8% survival rate. This is a really low point in Mao Zedong's rise to power. And you can see from some of the photographs taken at the time just how exhausted and dejected his troops are. Later on, Chinese propaganda is going to try and paint this as this uplifting underdog story, and it's going to be an important part of sort of the legend of Mao Zedong that the propaganda creates. And Mao Zedong is able to find a rather surprising upside to this brutal defeat and the Long March, which is he wasn't the one who made the call for the Red Army to go directly up against Chiang Kai shek's nationalist forces. It was the other communist leaders who pressured them into doing it. They were the ones who had ordered him to switch from the successful guerrilla tactics to direct battle. And so Mao Zedong was able to pretty easily put the blame for this massive defeat on them. That allows him to drive them out of power and take complete control of the Chinese Communist Party. He sets up camp near China's border with the Soviet Union, and that proximity to the Soviet Union is going to give him some level of protection, and he sets about rebuilding his army. He is not done yet. However, an attempt to retake control of China is going to have to wait because World War II breaks out. And in China, the outbreak of World War II means a brutal Japanese invasion. In the face of this formidable outside threat, the Chinese Communist and Nationalist Party actually worked together. That shows you just how threatening Japan was at the time. However, they both opposed Japan in two very different ways. Chiang Kai shek's nationalist KMT party, because they are the official Chinese government, end up doing most of the fighting, and they do this fighting in the very traditional direct battle type of way. Well, Japan's much more industrialized and therefore has a much better equipped army than China does, so in these direct confrontations, Japan usually comes out ahead, meaning Chiang Kai shek's nationalists are significantly weakened and are often having to go on the retreat. Mao Zedong's Communist Red Army, however, is able to use guerrilla tactics, that's kind of Mao Zedong's specialty, and those prove very effective against Japan's army. They only fight when they think they can win, they use ambushes, hit and run, and they steadily are able to gain land. And with this demonstrated success against the Japanese invaders, they also gain a lot of public support. So when World War II ends, Chiang Kai shek's nationalists aren't looking so great, and Mao Zedong's communists are on the rise. After World War II ends, Mao Zedong takes advantage of this shift in power and goes on the attack, restarting China's civil war. Mao's Red Army rebrands itself with the very positive sounding name of the People's Liberation Army, and they start winning. The United States and other Western powers are worried by these communist successes. With the end of World War II, we're now officially in the Cold War, and so the United States funnels a ton of money and resources into Chiang Kai shek's Nationalist Party. However, at this point, corruption within Chiang Kai shek's army has become widespread, and a lot of those resources do very little good on the battlefield. Ultimately, Chiang Kai shek and the rest of the KMT flee to the little island of Taiwan off the coast of China. Now, they keep pumping out propaganda saying that they are the legitimate government and still in charge of China. So even from this tiny little island, they're claiming to really be running all of this, but they really have no power to back it up. However, because a communist government is now effectively in charge of China, a lot of Western powers, including the United States, play along with this claim and for a long time refuse to accept the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party and pretend that Taiwan is still in charge. However, in reality, Mao Zedong has seized control of mainland China, and he announces the creation of the People's Republic of China under a communist government in 1949. The United States refuses to recognize Mao Zedong's government, and so Mao Zedong cozies up further with the Soviet Union. He signs a mutual defense pact with Joseph Stalin, and you get a bunch of great propaganda from the time celebrating what best friends the Soviet Union and Communist China are. I love propaganda art from this time period. It's just so over the top. But this increased alliance between two massive world powers, like just look at the Soviet Union and China on the map, has the United States really worried, amping up Cold War tensions even further. Within China itself, Mao Zedong's Communist Party is going to set about implementing socialist reforms. Unlike the Soviet Union, they're going to focus on farmers and peasants over factory workers. They seize the estates of the wealthy elite and give the land to peasants. Later on, they copy the Soviets and set up communes. So communes were massive farms, almost plantation-like, that were worked by the peasants but were owned by the government. The farmers don't privately own this land, and the goals for their farming are set by the state. Also, some of the farming techniques that they use are going to be determined by the state. Now, if you remember how the first of Stalin's 5-year plans in Russia went, this should be setting off some alarm bells. These large communes are not going to be run efficiently, and the new farming techniques promoted by the government are going to be based much more on ideology and not a lot of scientific backing. They're going to involve a lot of really bad farming practices, like planting a ton of seeds in one place because community will make them grow stronger. Yeah, that's not how plants work. This is going to have some serious repercussions down the line. At first, it looks like things are going well. In addition to these farm reforms, they also socialize industry, the government seizes control of factories, and they implement a 5-year plan to increase industrial output. And with all these government resources backing it, they succeed. China doubles its industrial production over this 5-year term. You see a lot of propaganda celebrating it, depicting things like the construction of railroads, and I don't know what's happening here, but they've got a lot of industrial consumer goods, and they seem real happy about it. Encouraged by the success of this 5-year plan, Mao Zedong implements something known as the Great Leap Forward. And here's where things really fall apart. They set even higher targets for agriculture and industry. They're expecting farmers and factories to produce even more. And as part of this, they try to combine farming and factory work by having farmers do something they call backyard projects, where they build tiny little smelters behind their house and try to produce steel on their farm. This is a disaster. It increases the farmer's workload even more for very little results. Like, these homemade backyard smelters are not anywhere near the quality of a full-on factory. Most of the steel they're making is really cheap quality and not usable for anything. So they're having to take time away from their farming to yield basically nothing. However, at this point, Mao Zedong has copied the brutal leadership style that Joseph Stalin was practicing, becoming the type of leader that you don't really report failures to. And so, regional governors, despite the fact that the farms are failing, aren't willing to risk their lives reporting this failure to Mao Zedong. So the reports that the central government is getting is, everything's fine, it's great, we met our quotas, look at all this food that we were able to grow. And they take as much food as they can from their farmers to try and meet these quotas, even if that means leaving the farmers with no food left. This kicks off a massive famine. In 1961, China experiences the worst famine in all of human history, and 30 million people die, making the Great Leap Forward, with its misleadingly optimistic name, a humanitarian disaster. If you want to learn more about this, one of the podcasts is specifically about the Great Leap Forward. Mao Zedong's reputation is really hurt by the failure of the Great Leap Forward. 30 million people dying, not great for your popularity. Around this time, Joseph Stalin is also going to die, and his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, isn't going to be nearly as brutal as Joseph Stalin. In his attempts to make the Soviet Union into a slightly friendlier, kinder country, is going to clash with Mao Zedong's policies in China, because Mao Zedong is still going to be following Stalin's model. Relationships are going to worsen. The Soviet Union is going to cut off aid to China and end its official alliance. There's even going to be instances where it looks like the Soviet Union and China might even go to war. There's a podcast on that as well, about an underground city that China makes in case of invasion by the Soviet Union. But all in all, things are looking really bad for Mao Zedong. The Great Leap Forward lost him a lot of popular support at home, and with the death of Joseph Stalin, he loses his most powerful international ally. In a bid to try and hold on to power, he makes a very dangerous move. By 1966, there's an entire generation of children that had been raised on communist propaganda, and he turns to them as a power base. He calls on them to revive the spirit of revolution, and he makes them into something called the Red Guards. He gives them actual political authority, not only to spread propaganda by reading out of what is known as the Little Red Book, sort of a collection of Mao Zedong's teachings and communist propaganda, he also calls on them to take violent action. In an event known as the Cultural Revolution, he calls on these child soldiers of the Red Guard to attack anyone who he deems anti-revolutionary. And we've seen this type of call to arms before in things like the Reign of Terror in France, Joseph Stalin's Great Purge. Anti-revolutionary can be a very vague definition. In this case, it includes both Communist Party members and government officials who Mao Zedong sees as a threat to his power, also artists, intellectuals, and anyone who they feel adheres too much to older ideas, which, when you have an army of child soldiers, can basically mean any adults. There's horrifying stories of children turning on their own parents, teachers are also heavily targeted, and millions are killed. And in case you're thinking I'm exaggerating when I'm describing the Red Guard as child soldiers, here's some of the photographs. We're talking kids as young as middle and elementary school. And they are armed. Here's a group of them posing for a photo shoot with handguns, and here's a picture of some of the results of their violent attacks. The Cultural Revolution spirals out of control really quickly, far beyond what Mao Zedong had even expected. Mao Zedong himself starts to worry that this might spark another civil war, and he disbands the Red Guards. Upheaval is going to continue, but the most extreme violence is going to end. The entire Chinese Communist Revolution is an incredibly complicated event, which I've simplified down a lot to try and fit into just one lesson, so there's a lot of podcasts on it if you want to learn more. And I encourage you to do so. I honestly feel kind of bad about all of the details that I had to cut for that. To wrap things up in a really summarized form, there's going to be ongoing turmoil in China until Mao Zedong's death in 1976. After his death, because his reign had involved so much violent upheaval, his successors are going to try and back away from some of his more adamant policies, and relationships will slowly improve with Western powers. Which is why I'm going to end the lecture with a photo of US President Richard Nixon making the first diplomatic visit to China since the Chinese Communist Revolution. And here he is looking very dubious at a dinner welcoming to China, which was a very important symbol of the easing of tensions between the United States and China. Clearly things are still a little bit tense to modern times, but compared to relationships at the height of the Cold War, there's been some drastic improvements. And with that, we'll wrap things up for today. Stay safe, stay healthy, and get in touch if you need anything.